In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle.
More durable than a castle, you say? Well, that was easy. Reese, how's the castle?
It's more durable than a castle. 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 You don't get away with anything. And so you might think you can bend the fabric of reality and that you can treat people instrumentally and that you can bow to the tyrant and violate your conscience without cost. You will pay the piper.
Oh, I will indeed pay the piper. I'll pay him by enduring Jordan Peterson's exodus. For you, my fellow apes. For you. You better feel the love.
It's going to call you out of that slavery into freedom, even if that pulls you into the desert.
Ah yes, the desert. The Great Plains of Emancipation.
God is ethic-centered, not ethnic-centered.
Dennis, I know that you think that you're smart. We can see it very clearly on your face. But as you're a practicing religious Jew, need I remind you that God explicitly aligns himself with one ethnicity, the Israelites.
And we're going to see that there's something else going on here that is far more cosmic and deeper than what you can imagine.
Oh boy. I'm going to need a cosmically sized coffee that's deeper than even Jordan Peterson can imagine.
The highest ethical spirit to which we're beholden is presented precisely as that spirit that allies itself with the cause of freedom against tyranny.
Hold on a sec. It's been a while since I've adjusted my Christian chakras, so just give me a sec. Alright, I can now translate from Jordan to nearly human. The highest ethical spirit, God, who we are beholden to under the tyrannical threat of eternal torture, is opposed to tyranny. Remind me, what's the definition of tyranny again? Reese, what's your definition of tyranny?
Well, are you offering to free me into the desert unless I can pull the castle down with my hands? Well, that's pretty tyrannical, yeah. What else? Oh yeah, you taking my car and telling me I can't have it back unless I worship you. That's pretty tyrannical as well, Steve. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. I want villains to get punished.
But do you want the villains to learn before they have to pay the ultimate price?
That's such a Christian question.
Alright, no more messing around. Let's descend into the belly of the beast to save our father from himself. Buckle up, buccos, because this is going to be a hell of a ride. Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Welcome to the first in my series of responses to Dr. Jordan Peterson's roundtable on Exodus. Having a rating on IMDb of 9.1 out of 10, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is joined by formidable theological and literary scholars for an in-depth analysis of the second book in both the Christian Bible and the Torah. Formidable theological and literary scholars, huh?
My favorite part of writing the commentary over these years is to take these verses that seem like nothing and realize it's so important.
The Jews bitch a lot. Like a lot.
Look, I know that theists are ever more favouring the metaphorical over the literal, but the only thing that Dennis and Ben are formidable at is exhibiting cosmic confidence.
Far more cosmic and deeper than what you can imagine.
So, what do we have in store? Well, as the Daily Wire puts it, in this powerful follow-up to Peterson's wildly popular lecture series on Genesis, viewed by over 40 million people and counting, this deep dive on the book of Exodus takes viewers on an intellectual and philosophical journey that will educate and enlighten believers and non-believers alike on universal topics like faith, freedom, ethics, morality, politics, and more. Given that it's on the Daily Wire, I can assure you that for non-believers, the vast majority of it is as enlightening as bashing your skull against a castle.
It's more durable than a castle.
And you know what? The vast majority of it is equally as enlightening for theists too. It's a giant circle jerk of confirmation bias. Each episode is around the 2-hour mark, and as of recording, there's 17 episodes. Consequently, my series of responses is likely to be biblical in itself, and so expect an episode every few weeks or so. As is the case with most Daily Wire content, the production quality is superb. It's extremely well made. Seriously, if you have a turd that needs polishing, Send it their way. They'll lick it clean. That said, this series isn't like Dennis Prager's Master's Program, or Ben Shapiro's The Atheist Delusion. No, it's not all low fruit with this one. There's some really interesting conversations to explore that certainly have room for rational disagreement. The format consists of Jordan reading out Exodus out loud so that he and his team, which changes per episode, can interpret as many conservative talking points and themes as possible. For instance, that the emancipation of women has spelt the end of civilization.
I think it's a good lesson for us today, which is that the tyrant is empowering women to kill their men. That is what the tyrant is doing. And he's doing it in order to feminize the Hebrews.
So yes, if you want to see out-of-touch old white men complaining about women's liberation, then the Daily Wire is for you.
When we think that that couldn't happen, like in a people, it's like, look around you.
Look around you.
We're seeing it happen before our very eyes.
Those damn feminists, I tell you. The second you break their chains of reproductive subservience, they go and do their own thing like men.
This is an outrage.
What now are the incels going to do? With Western civilization no longer commodifying half of its citizens, these mediocre men are going to have to clean their room, aren't they?
Matrix is strong.
To just scratch the surface, throughout the coming months, you're going to see Jordan and I agreeing more than less on morality. I know it's going to be a hell of a ride. You're also going to see Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro dismiss the entirety of left-wing concerns as simply ingratitude and cultivated cravings.
What we are experiencing, in my view, at this time in America, is the cultivation of ingratitude.
Right? It's the craving that's to blame. They're not saying we want meat because we're hungry for meat. They're saying we are going to cultivate ingratitude. We're going to cultivate a craving.
But today, you're going to see a theologian and associate professor at Cambridge, no less, demonstrate that he somehow doesn't know what atheism is. Which, I have to say, lends some credence to Dennis's claims of university education being problematic.
The least wise places in America are the most secular places. They're called universities.
You know, I can't help but think that if the Exodus crew had just one scholar that didn't sing their song, then they'd have had a much more fruitful exchange. They'd have recognised objections and been able to provide rejoinders. But I get it. Breaking out of the alluring comfort of our echo chamber is hard. However, I found a tool that's helped me shatter mine: Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that compares news across the political spectrum, effortlessly providing transparency of factual reliability and bias. Let me give you an example. On the homepage, we can see what's hitting the news, such as reports of global temperature set to break a key threshold. If we click on the title, we receive a summary of the story, but it's on the sidebar that the magic happens. We can see how many outlets have covered the topic, and what the general bias distribution looks like. For instance, this story is predominantly being reported by left-leaning outlets. Scrolling down, we can also see who owns the reporting outlets, the factual reliability of the information given, the time and location of publications, and key insights. Pretty cool, right? Or here's another example that's got a flipped distribution. When it comes to China apparently funding Biden, left-leaning reports are few and far between. And I say apparently because, at least as of now, its factual status is mixed. Now, as someone who wants to converse with people from different walks of life, I need to be able to speak their language, and to speak their language, I need to understand their narrative. Ground News has proven to be a very useful tool in this regard, and for a very reasonable price. If you too would like to be better informed, then please click my link. Thanks. Alright, for this episode I want to respond to and expand upon a few claims and statements made by Dr. James Orr and Jordan relating to morality, and more specifically, an apparently huge problem that uniquely atheists face. Before we get to that, however, I want to provide context of the dialectic and comment on a few other remarks and claims made by Dr. Douglas Headley and Dr. Os Guinness. 25 minutes into the first episode, Jordan reads out loud Exodus 1:15-16.
And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birthing stools. If it be a son, then you shall kill him. And that's that instrumental usage that you were talking about before.
There is a huge issue here. The Hebrew is completely indeterminative whether the midwives were Hebrews or not.
As seen, Dennis brings up that it's not clear in Hebrew whether the murdering midwives are themselves Hebrew or Egyptian, and he then gives us an argument for why he thinks that they're Egyptian. Moving on, he then jumps to verse 17, wherein the midwives refuse to carry out Pharaoh's orders on account of fearing God.
You either fear humans or you fear God. Fear God is the root of freedom and wisdom.
Right, so fearing a human tyrant is unwise and lacks freedom, but fearing an omnipotent tyrant is wise and the root of freedom. Got it. Jordan then asks specifically Douglas why the midwives are motivated out of fear. Why didn't they act out of love, let's say, or intuition? Why did they only act out of fear of a greater tyrant? And it's here that I'll offer my first comment.
Douglas, do you have any sense of what it means in this passage and more broadly that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom and an appropriate, let's say, precondition for freedom? Why do you think it's conceptualized as fear?
Well, I think there's a proper fear that in this case I think is linked to transcendence. So there's the fear of the tyrant, which is normal and natural, and which we are all subject to. But there should be a greater fear, i.e. the fear of the transcendent
of violating it.
Violating that,
right,
yes.
Right.
And of course, this is why the postmodern attack on traditional Western culture is so dangerous. I mean, of course, it goes back to the very origins of Western culture with the sophists, but the idea that there is no such thing as an objective moral order, and there certainly is no transcendent basis for that, that would make this whole narrative unintelligible.
But would it? Really? Is it really the case that if objective moral order doesn't exist, then we can't make sense of the midwives refusing Pharaoh? I think this is very obviously false. We could make sense of the midwives simply by emphasizing that, when faced with either fulfilling the Pharaoh's orders or living up to their moral intuitions, they favoured the latter. This provides a very plausible explanation that doesn't require us to buy into all sorts of supernatural ontology, nor, indeed, any objective moral framework. We are, at the end of the day, a social species. We've evolved to protect our kin, and a command to kill innocent babies is a direct affront to our social software. Such a command violates millions of years of evolutionary programming. And note that this explanation doesn't require us to assume that our moral software is predicated on some traditional objective moral framework that exists in a metaphysical realm. As Laplace said to Napoleon when asked why he didn't involve God in his reasoning, "Sire, we have no need for that hypothesis. Including it doesn't improve the explanation, and it only adds baggage. Lots of additional ontological expensive propositions." Marching on, Jordan then explains that when he speaks courageously, such as when he mocks trans people on Twitter, it's wrong to categorize him as brave, as many do, because just like the midwives who refuse to fulfill Pharaoh's orders, he refuses to violate his moral intuition, his God, if you will.
It also makes the tyrant the final arbiter in some real sense, right?
It becomes justification.
You know, people have asked me, and I'm always embarrassed by this, but people have commented on my courage for speaking up, so to speak. And I think you don't actually understand the situation. I'm not courageous in my speaking up. I'm more afraid of the alternative. And part of the reason for that was that when I was a clinician and I spent thousands, tens of thousands of hours dealing with people's serious problems, one of the things I learned was, and I really learned this, was that you don't get away with anything. And so you might think you can bend the fabric of reality and that you can treat people instrumentally and that you can bow to the tyrant without and violate your conscience without cost, but that is just not the case. You will pay the piper.
Indeed, you will pay the piper. If you egregiously violate your social software, you'll be in hell for the rest of your days. Again, though, we can account for this very easily, in fact, under a naturalistic rubric. Expanding upon this, Jordan explains that much of his work revolved around helping people confront and accept their bad decisions, to which James rather peculiarly claims that this is hard to account for on a secular frame.
When you pay, you might not even notice the causal connection between the sin and the payment. And one of the things you do in psychotherapy is people's lives take a twist and they go very badly wrong. And when you walk back through people's lives with them, you come to these choice points where you meet the devil at the crossroads and you find out that, well, you went left, let's say, and downhill when you should have gone right and uphill, and now you're paying the price for that. And you don't impose that as a therapist. You help people discover that or rediscover it, because they often know at the time that they've made an error and then forget and then rationalize the forgetting and then, and then multiply the lies. And so,
but that's tremendously difficult to do within a secular frame.
But as we've just discussed, it isn't tremendously difficult to account for this on a secular frame. If we lived before Darwin, then sure, it would be fairly difficult to account for, but we are not ancient Israelites. We are not beset by ignorance. Anyhow, I'm going to have to speedrun us to the main things I want to comment on, as if I don't, this video will be infinitely long. After a bit of back and forth, Oz takes us back to postmodernism.
But don't you think our culture is approaching a kind of crisis point? In other words, the postmodernists, everything's constructive, truth is not there, etc., etc. There's no reality except what you make it.
And yes, they often conflate atheism, secularism, postmodernism, Marxism, and all other conservative boogeymen into one monstrous contradictory entity. It's a mess. I have seldom seen scholars be so sloppy.
Well, if there's no God, no truth. There is only power.
Right. Well, that's the Dostoevskian issue in some real sense, isn't it?
And yes, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, and Jung are ever present throughout the series, as to be expected with Jordan. From here, Jonathan Pageau brings up the bizarre notion that empowering women has enabled them to kill men.
When we think that couldn't happen, like in a people, it's like, look around you. We're seeing it happen before our very eyes.
I know, it's a cringe cathedral, but rest assured, because I'm going to deep dive on this topic in a separate episode, since it's truly a cosmically deep conservative talking point that cries out for its own exodus out of respectful dialogue. Following this, the conversation pivots back to the claim that if there is no God, then there's only power. And then, per Godwin's law, we get to Nazis.
If you think of the Nuremberg trial, they didn't actually have a basis for what they were saying. There's no international law.
Jordan then speaks about how Solzhenitsyn believed that the Nuremberg trials re-established objective moral values.
Well, that's certainly what Solzhenitsyn thought about the Nuremberg trials.
On Douglas's lead, they then speak about how moral intuitions are visions as opposed to verbal conceptualizations.
Yeah, and it is a vision too, and not just a mere verbal conceptualization.
Jordan then shares how, when with his students and patients, he focuses on the vision as opposed to verbal concepts.
You could conceivably have what you wanted, but you have to specify what it is and you have to have a vision of it.
And he concludes from this that secular and especially religious education should cultivate these visions.
And part of what the humanities education should do, and the religious education certainly, is to flesh out a vision of a mode of being and a mode of perception that would justify suffering, or maybe even more than justify it. So,
well, you could say, I suppose, that if theists are faced with the problem of evil, atheists are confronted with the problem of good, trying how to make sense of goodness, how to make sense of what it is that drives their moral indignation and their great social revolutions.
You know how it takes a lot more time to tidy your room than to mess it up? Yeah. Go get Henry. We've finally arrived at the primary claim I want to address in this episode. It's taken a while for us to get from murdering midwives to atheists having the problem of good, but you made it. Have a cookie. So, here's an objection. Claiming that atheism has a problem of good represents an utter failure to appreciate why theism is burdened with the problem of evil.
If theists are faced with the problem of evil, atheists are confronted with the problem of good.
The reason why evil is a problem for theists, and more specifically followers of Abrahamic religion, is because there's tension between God's alleged attributes and the existence of evil. It's claimed that God is all-powerful, which means that he has the power to prevent evil, and it's claimed that God is all-loving, which means that he has the desire to prevent evil. Yet, when we stroll through the remains of mass extinctions and witness natural disasters, predation, parasitic diseases, and other forms of suffering in the world, it appears obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that we're beset by gratuitous evil. That is, evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good. This poses a significant problem for religious Jews, Christians, and Muslims. By maintaining that an all-powerful and all-loving God exists, they're committed to a worldview that cannot admit of any gratuitous evil whatsoever. None. To them, every single instance of gratuitous evil must necessarily be an illusion, just as it might have appeared evil when your parents held you down so that a stranger could pull one of your teeth out, but it turned out that it wasn't in fact evil, it was for the greater good. Theists are forced to apply the same logic to absolutely every instance of apparent evil. To illustrate the problem, consider the human species of Neanderthals. Neanderthals, like every species on Earth, emerged through the brutal process of evolution by natural selection, and thus every one of their attributes was the result of monumental suffering. Take, for instance, their light skin, similar to my own and similar to everyone at the table here. In regions where there's lower levels of sunlight, it's harder for dark skin to absorb sufficient vitamin D. Hence, those with mutations that resulted in lighter skin were more likely to survive and successfully reproduce. But, you know, expressing it this way is too cold. It fails to capture the loss and sorrow. Picture, if you will, that we are a Neanderthal family, gathering in a cold and damp cave around an anguished mother who holds her dying baby in her arms in grief and despair. Despite our tireless efforts to provide for our child, it's obvious that we've somehow failed. We're haunted by thoughts of what we could have done differently to prevent this tragedy, this complete loss of potential. Never again will that child smile, and nor, we feel, will any of us. A numbness has overwhelmed us. We're angry at ourselves. This is the third child we've lost this winter. What, we cry out, have we done wrong? What gods have we failed to praise? What devils twist our fate? We don't know why our children are dying. What the fuck is going wrong? How have we so egregiously failed to protect our loved ones? We're petrified, frustrated, and utterly demoralised. And for what? Because despite this long process eventually leading to a population that can absorb sufficient vitamin D, what happened? Neanderthals went extinct. Countless people suffered untold injuries, diseases, and predation only to have their lineage and cultures collapse. And yet, followers of Abrahamic religion have to somehow believe that the indifferent and brutal millions of years of evolution that eventually came to nothing wasn't gratuitous evil. It was a tooth that God simply had to pull. It was for the greater good. And I can't stress this enough. Classical theists have to maintain this position. This utterly pathetic, absurd, irrational position. And most of them sincerely believe that people like me that can't convince themselves of this absurdity deserve eternal torment.
This must be for the best somehow.
And the fact that it's damn well difficult to provide a satisfying explanation for why this isn't an instance of gratuitous evil, not to mention the million other examples, is indeed a problem. It's the problem of evil for theists. Atheism, on the other hand, has no problem whatsoever making sense of evil or indeed good, since atheism doesn't posit a proposition that contradicts the existence of evil or good. For James's charge of atheism having a problem of good to land, he must demonstrate that atheism somehow entails that the world is entirely evil and thus has a problem of making sense of good. But it doesn't. Before moving on, I have to say that the frequency at which theists misrepresent atheism, which, let's face it, isn't exactly a complex proposition, is astounding. I expect, however, such rudimentary mistakes from the likes of Frank Turek, Ken Ham, and Dennis Prager, but it still surprises me when I hear them from the likes of James. As an associate professor at Cambridge, he surely is aware that atheism doesn't entail any specific moral views. No?
Atheists are confronted with the problem of good.
No, we're not.
One of the most terrifying moments in the Nuremberg trials was when the Nazis advanced the defense that this was simply victor's justice, that they had not really broken any laws. They were scrupulous legislators, after all. And
following orders.
That's right.
When the Nazis attempted to justify their acts on account of them simply following orders, the moral bankruptcy of a command-based ethical framework appeared, to most of us at least, as light as day. If morality is, at its base, predicated on the whims of a dictator, or even a group, then it's not really morality, is it? It's victor's justice, as James put it.
This was simply victor's justice.
It's nothing more than might makes right. But why the hell is James presenting this as a uniquely atheist problem? I mean, put it this way, when Moses and the Israelites slaughtered the Midianites, as written in Numbers 31:17 through 18, he justified doing so by uttering the exact same sentiment as the Nazis. Moses appealed to a command-based ethical framework. God commanded him to kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that has known a man by lying with him, but all the woman children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Just as the guards at Auschwitz took babies by the legs and swung them into train carts, Moses and the Israelites did the same. What's more, they took baby girls as slaves. Now, if you find the horrific acts of the Nazis and the acts of other tyrannical regimes such as the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan revolting, then so too should you find the claimed events of the biblical text revolting. Of course, James would take issue with this comparison, as would most theists. They'd insist that while these regimes appeal to human commands, Moses appealed to divine commands, and that this constitutes a symmetry breaker. And yes, we're just going to ignore that the Japanese thought the emperor a god, and we're just ignore that the Nazis were God-fearing Christians. This disagreement would almost certainly lead to a debate around the Euthyphro dilemma, which would take us too far aside for current purposes. But if you're interested in exploring the dialectic, then please see our episode on Dennis Prager's Master's Programme, which, if God wills, should be on screen now. I said, if God wills. Thank you, God. Really appreciate it. I will sacrifice a goat to you in due course.
Oh, Lord. Oh, you are so big.
Hail, Big G. So, to get back on track, when stripped of the bells and whistles, theists are simply following orders. They mutilate the genitals of babies because God commands them to. They execute homosexuals because God commands them to. Well, they still do in many countries, and especially those dominated by Islam, but in countries where secularism has caught on, such as in the West, they very recently and extremely conveniently reinterpreted the otherwise explicit commands as to accommodate their intuitive moral indignation. Funny that, ain't it? The Bible is inerrant, and yet God suspiciously changes his mind according to socio-economic incentive. Oh, it's amazing. It's just cosmically deep.
That's right. And so sort of Western notions of justice found themselves staring into the abyss. How is it that we're going to make sense of our deep intuition that this is evil of an absolute kind?
To keep my repetition brief, just as our social and moral software is egregiously violated by the notion of murdering babies, it's also egregiously violated by the notion of genocide. The fact that we all intuit the same moral indignation doesn't entail the existence of a supernatural metaphysical realm. But how, then, do we make sense of people sometimes overriding this moral software? Well, to paraphrase Voltaire, if you want people to commit atrocities, you need only convince them of absurdities. The reason the Germans could violate their deep-rooted intuitions is because they convinced themselves that their victims were not human. And the same is true of the Israelites. They convinced themselves that they weren't murdering innocent babies, but rather enemies of God. Somehow they were acting for the greater good, which, again, is an absurdity that the Nazis also convinced themselves of.
So the problem on the atheist front is, on what basis can these things be claimed as self-evident? What's the grounding for that if it's just not? And the postmodern critique of that in some sense is that, well, all that nonsense talk about rights and freedoms is just instrumental camouflage, hiding a more fundamental will to power and desire to oppress.
Thanks, Jordan, for again conflating atheism with postmodernism. You're really looking out for your atheist neighbours there, mate. Now, I could address Jordan's implicit claims here, but there's going to be many more opportunities for me to do this. Instead, I'll focus on the core. Notice that we've gone from the Pharaoh commanding the extermination of little boys to the apparent unique atheist problem of grounding morality. Yeah, soak that in, people, because this is apologetics at its finest. We've even got the team painting atheists as seeing only power to oppress as their guide.
There is only power.
And the worry is that the only answer available in that, in a purely sort of secular framework, would be because this document tells us that this is wrong, or this document tells us that this is right.
No, it's not the words, it's not the document, but rather the vision the words embody. The words symbolize our collective intuitions. We are all human, we are all one lineage, and as a social species, we can expect that there will be some clear-cut instances where we all intuit that something is bad. Human rights instantiate these visions. They're not arbitrary, like, ironically, God's commands are. Put it this way, if, instead of the Pharaoh, God had commanded the midwives to bash the skulls of the baby boys into rocks, we are led by James, Jordan, and the rest of the crew to conclude that this would indeed be a moral thing to do. They'd all say that it's perfectly kosher. In fact, they do say that it's perfectly kosher when God issues equivalent commands, such as what he did in Numbers 31, 17 through 18.
There is only power.
As an atheist, I've come to accept that the vast majority of theists will never put in the work to understand the very simple proposition of atheism. It's just too much to ask for. Most theists don't get into theology to earnestly consider alternatives. No, they get into theology in the pursuit of post hoc rationalization. But you know what? It still breaks my heart that scholars are just as bad as the average apologist. And should the tides keep turning in favour of a secular, non-religious world, as they very much have been, and should we, when we are the majority, refuse to earnestly consider their concerns and positions, just as they have refused to consider us for millennia, then it might just be the case that we'd be witnessing the result of the piper not being paid. When the conversation is forever stuck at the refusal to shake hands, don't expect a cordial meal. So, there you have it, folks, my first critique of Jordan Peterson's Exodus. Despite my frustration with their inability to reasonably represent, much less respectfully consider atheism, I've nevertheless found their exchange fruitful, if only because it helps me better understand conservative motifs and narratives that I believe in this day and age are destructive to human flourishing. Unfortunately, though, when it comes to atheism, we're facing the same issue as we often do with apologetic content. Instead of encouraging an enlightening and insightful exchange, the Exodus crew perpetuate negative stereotypes and prejudices against atheists, conflating us with all of their other conservative boogeymen. Alright, that's going to do it for me for now. My Christian chakras are misaligned, leaving me in a state of wanting to run headfirst into a castle.
I think I just found Jesus.
As said at the beginning, I'm aiming to create a lot of videos similar to this one in the foreseeable future. If you'd like to encourage me in doing so, and supply my team and myself with a cosmic coffee, because by Zeus's beard we're bloody well gonna need it, then please check out our Patreon or YouTube membership. I can't stress enough the difference you make to improving our quality and quantity. We're not quite at the production quality of our competition yet, but rest assured, because I'm sure we're gonna get there. Thanks.